the scientists of today are standing on the shoulders of believers, of Christians, who, scientists who recognize that there is a God in the heavens who created the earth, and he has endowed us with the ability to search out the truth and to develop and invent and participate in creation with God.
Yeah. And what I've said doesn't mean for an instant that you can't be a non-Christian and a good scientist.
Correct.
That you can't be an atheist and a good scientist. There have been plenty of good scientific discoveries done by atheists, by Buddhists, by Muslims, and so on, by Jews. Jews, of course, have the same worldview as Christians. A rational creator makes a rational universe to be understood by rational human beings. Doesn't mean you can't be a good scientist and a non-Christian. What it does mean, though, is that the epistemological foundation of science is this Christian worldview.
And the milieu that supports it and provides the foundation.
And if you've abandoned that foundation, but been taught the practices of science, you can keep doing that. But eventually, you consume all of that philosophical, that epistemological capital. Sometimes we talk about a society living on the moral capital of previous generations. But as that deteriorates, you have moral decay going on. Well, I think we're seeing that in the sciences, and particularly in relation to climate science and the whole debate, or non-debate, as is often the case because the other side won't debate this issue. We're seeing it happening in climate science, where scientists are failing to recognize that the universe is a real thing out there that is subject to rational investigation. Here's one thing that happens with many of them, and this was told about by a sociologist of science by the name of Marianne Lassen in an article, a very famous article called Seductive Simulations. She spent 6 years living with and studying climate scientists at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, one of the main places where climate modeling gets done. And a fundamental question she had for herself was, do these scientists keep in the forefront of their minds the difference between their model output, the numbers their models generate, right, and the real world? Now, model output is not evidence of anything. It is just hypothesis. Evidence is observations in the real world. Now, you have to keep those distinct, or you begin to forget to test. And what she found in her 6 years with them was that whereas most of them could state that distinction theoretically in the abstract, they didn't live it. They spoke of the output of their models as if that were the real climate. Well, that's part of the breakdown between an approach to the world that sees it as an objective reality out there versus a mystical way of coming to knowledge. And it's really what, as a Christian theologian, I would call a flight from logos. Logos, the Greek word for word, or better translated, reason. That's showing up in spades in what's called post-normal science. And in post-normal science, essentially you get the application of postmodern deconstructionism, which is a literary theory and says language doesn't exist to convey truth or meaning, but only to project power, to force other people to do what you want them to do. Post-normal science is essentially postmodern deconstruction applied to the sciences. And then science is no longer the pursuit of truth. It is instead the projection of power, where you go through the motions of science to provide rationale for a previously determined agenda. Dr. Mike Hume, who is was professor of climate change for many years at the University of East Anglia, made famous for the Climategate scandal, where thousands of emails were released that showed that people at the very center of the global warming alarmist movement were fabricating data, exaggerating data, suppressing contrary data, intimidating scientists with contrary views, and so on. Mike Hume wrote that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a post-normal scientific institution.
And that wasn't a criticism.
That's right. Yeah. He was commending it for that because he's a proponent of post-normal science. Not only that, he also wrote in his book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, He wrote, "In a world dominated by capitalism, climate change is a handy thing to come along," because as he puts it, climate change can be a reason for furthering a lot of the political ideas that we've had all along, but not been able to show a good rationale for.
Basically admitting that he and others like him are using it as a tool.
Politically driven.
Yeah, politically driven. And that's what we see in the agenda of so much of the climate modeling alarmist community.
Yes.
Correct? It's a huge corruptive influence because there's billions and billions of dollars going into that.
Yeah, the U.S. alone spends over $2 billion every year just on climate change-related scientific research. And then there's all the rest of the money that's spent on all sorts of other climate change-related work, policy work, regulatory work, and so on. And that's just the U.S. government. European governments spend billions. Even as much as 6 years ago, the total spent by governments on scientific research trying to provide a basis for embracing the Kyoto Protocol to reduce CO2 emissions had totaled over $79 billion. The people involved, I think, have no concept of how corrupting government money can be on the scientific community.
Well, we have seen in recent history in Nazi Germany, they had many good scientists there, but when the government controlled all the funding and all the research facilities, those scientists all, for the most part, those that didn't flee the country, got in line behind the agenda of the government.
He who pays the piper calls the tune.
And the same thing in all of the communist socialist countries. Yes. Scientists are not allowed to deviate from what is the party line. And we're seeing that more and more as you mentioned the ClimateGate emails demonstrated that those scientists who dissented from what is now the new orthodoxy of climate science were being penalized and undermined. And
losing grants, losing teaching positions, not gaining
tenure, not being allowed to publish.
Articles turned down by magazines. The editor of one journal that published a contrarian piece had to resign his job. He was put under such pressure. Just recently, Dr. Lennart Bengtsson, one of the giants of meteorology around the world, began to realize, you know what, the models have far exaggerated the warming effect of added CO2. He began to be a little skeptical about this stuff. He published a few articles that indicated that skepticism. He was invited by the Global Warming Policy Foundation to be on their advisory board, and he accepted that invitation. And immediately, hundreds of emails and phone calls came in, angrily complaining about his decision to do this.
Because the global warming policy is skeptical of.
That's right. The Global Warming Policy Foundation is skeptical of this, and he said that it got to the point where he was afraid for his own health, where he was no longer able to pursue his continuing research activities. He was afraid for his family because of the pressure put on them by these people, so he withdrew himself from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. You know, I feel for him. I sympathize with what he went through. I've had plenty of pretty nasty things said about me. Not true, but that's the way it is. You stand up for the truth anyway.
Cornwall Alliance has been going for how many years?
We started in the summer of 2005, so we're at 9 years now.
Encouraging on what you see happening?
I am encouraged by a lot of different things. One, just simply in terms of the scientific evidence. When we started, nobody was really aware that even at that point in 2005, there had been a period of probably at least 7 or 8 years of no global warming. That was not yet clear from the data. Now we know that it has been 17 years and 10 months at least with no global warming. Now that was absolutely contrary to the predictions of all of the computer climate models on which the alarmists depend. If you're a good scientist, what that means is you realize, okay, our hypothesis was wrong, we have to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new hypothesis. They tend not to be wanting to do that, but I think the public in general gets it. They understand, you know what, if they predicted this and that didn't happen, there's something wrong there. So I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by meetings like this one, the 9th International Conference on Climate Change. I'm encouraged by the response that we get from the public when I go and speak in various places. I find more and more people already have heard a little bit of the other side, and when they hear, whether it's some of the scientific evidence or some of the economic analysis of the harms done by the policies, they're very receptive. So I'm encouraged.
Well, we have to renew all efforts and keep up the battle, but yeah, you're doing a fantastic job with the Cornwall Alliance. So
well, great. Thank you very much.